introducing Colin, I'm not going to give a biography of him. I've already said that he's one of the world's leading percussionists and has inspired so much repertoire, so much new work by some of the world's leading composers. And of course, something we're going to talk about this evening later on is his very strong relationship with Steve Reich. I think Colin started off with Steve being a huge inspiration to him. But I think if Steve were here, and I'm sure when he comes back to speak to us, he will say that Colin has subsequently been an enormous inspiration to him as a composer, and he's written many works for him. First, I'm just going to say welcome, Colin. It's really great to see you. Can I just ask you where you are at the moment? Because you could be anywhere.
Yes, indeed. But like a lot of people, I'm at home, which is a little par for the course at the moment. And I make my rather new home. I was a Londoner for the longest time, but I'm now living on the outskirts of Glasgow, quite close to where you grew up, Gillian. We've had a conversation about this. It's quite nice to hear about the different times and how the city's changed. But yeah, I'm happily living in Rutherglen in South Lanarkshire, and it's a beautiful sunny evening. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Yeah, and your big studio, which is a good reason to move to Glasgow, because you get a lot more space than you do in London, of course.
Aye, you do.
For a percussionist. Can you just tell us then this has been the most extraordinary and in fact the most terrible year for many people, but I think musicians have had a particularly hard time. Can you tell us what it's been like for you? What's this last year been like?
Well, it's been extremely difficult. I mean, I feel no particular need to sugarcoat it. My life, the way I live, the people I see, the way that I interact with the world has been brought to a standstill. It's been brought to a complete halt with really an embargo on my modus operandi. And I was in a very privileged position to have a career in which I did quite a lot of travel, visited many orchestras and colleagues all around the globe, and would habitually have half a dozen trips to the States a year for sure, maybe one or two to the Far East, all around Europe, and of course, many events in London, very particularly at the Southbank Centre. And what happened to me, many musicians have talked about it in this way, was that there were kinds of signs that things were going wrong, and everyone sort of kind of just got on with life for a little bit, and then there was a weekend where just poof, everything went. Yeah. And it was cancellation after cancellation, and it's like a bulldozer going through your diary, so moving everything this way and having an effect. Everything's kind of been bulldozed for at least a year, and it's been extremely difficult. There have been some things that I have held on to. I've been very grateful, for example, with the time that I've spent with my quartet, my percussion quartet. So three members of the group that we'll be talking about. I've seen quite a bit of them in COVID secure scenarios, and we've learned quite a bit of new repertoire, and even managed a extraordinary venture to Lithuania, Vilnius, which was known as the Vilnius debacle. And we even made commemorative water bottles because it was just the most extraordinary trip. It was sort of unlikely of trips, but we managed it, and things like that. And we actually played Steve Reich drumming there to an audience of about 300 people. And without any exaggeration, my absolute spiritual highlight of the year was the silence in the air after the last note of drumming, because when you leave that piece in midair and the audience try to come to terms with what they've heard, you got to cliche it. There's your magic. And that's what I had missed so badly. I mean, and we all had missed it so terribly, was, yes, performing, but it's that indefinable intimacy and sharing with the audience. So to have a taste of it again in October was quite something. But we're all the musicians and artists were absolutely bedraggled. I mean, we're just desperate to get back to crowds of people and that energy in the room.
Yeah, it's I've noticed that my husband, my son are, musicians, and they've not been able to do what they do for over a year now. And my husband says he dreams about it. He dreams about being on stage all the time. It's just this thing that you've been conditioned to do, I guess. But are there any, you mentioned that getting together with your quartet, it's been a positive. Have there been any other positives? Have there been things that you like, new things that you've learned about your musicianship because you've not been getting on a plane every 3 days, because you've not been rushing from one gig to the next? Have there been times where you've been able to sort of really focus down in a new way?
Yeah, I mean, I think on a less practical way, I mean, I certainly have had 2 or 3 occasions where I've taken a substantial break from actually playing. And for example, there was the occasion to pick up the, for example, the absolutely wonderful but very large and weighty new biography of Michael Tippett by Oliver. How do we say his name? Soden.
Yeah.
Oliver Soden. Yeah. It's a dictionary book, and it's the kind of thing that normally I would just never be able to sort of just get to a piece of literature like that. But last spring I picked it up and not only read it but listened through to a lot of Tippett's works at the same time as reading this biography, and this abundance of time that was on my hands. So things like that, and I read a little bit of a fan of Anthony Trollope. So it'd been a long time since I read a book by him, and his largest novel is a work, The Way We Live Now. And again, it's probably not something I would ordinarily read, but it was just wonderful to have the time to read it, and not only read it, but if there was a paragraph that I didn't quite connect to, just take the time to read it again, and maybe read it a 3rd or 4th time. So I think I was more in that kind of a zone. I didn't learn a whole bunch of new repertoire. I think a lot of musicians, I'll freely admit, we are inspired by the events that we have to prepare for. Yeah. And when the deadline approaches, that's when you do your great work, and you've got a concerto to premiere 10 days from now, and you still can't play it, and that bit's only at half speed. And that's that cut and thrust of preparing. Again, that's been taken away from us. So I was not sort of learning swathes of new marimba literature just for myself. I'm afraid I didn't have that in me. But
it sounds like you built up in other ways. You built up a different kind of hinterland that you normally wouldn't have time to do in other ways. Yeah. Can we talk about just about, you mentioned earlier your relationship with the Southbank, if we can touch on that for a moment, because you have been associated with this place or that place for a long time. Can you sort of tell us about how that transpired and about what it means to you? What you feel it's allowed you to do?
Yeah, with great pleasure. I mean, my early memories of coming to Southbank would be to hear Philharmonia, LPO, etc., London Sinfonietta, as a student. So in the mid 90s, I was at Royal Academy of Music 94 to 98. And I remember, for example, at that time, Leonard Slatkin was music director of the Philharmonia. So saw a lot of concerts with him. And then there was, for a time, it was great. It was every year, there was a sort of percussion festival called Rhythm Sticks, wasn't it called Rhythm Sticks? And I think my Southbank debut would have been a recital for that festival one summer. I saw the recital in the Purcell Room, which I still remember and remember being excited about. That would have been in something like 99 or 2000 maybe. So it goes way back. And then in the Jude Kelly era, like yourself, Gillian, I was sort of, I felt that, felt very taken under the wing of the Southbank by her, by yourself, and by many other people. I think also with what became my quite close association, particularly with the LPO, who really sort of supported a lot of my projects. And I've done 3 very important in my career, in a way, world premieres with them to date, with another one planned, another one that was actually postponed from last year by Danny Elfman. But over the course of about a decade now, I've premiered concertos by Eno-Juhani Rautavaara, Finnish composer. That would have been in 2009. Kalevi Aho, percussion concerto, one of my biggest pieces, most successful pieces, in 2012. And then the amazing Helen Grime concerto in 2019. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think I just love being at the Southbank, and I love the architecture of it. I'm a big fan of the modernist kind of style. For very little I know about it, but I do enjoy that. I like the space, the quirkiness of it, and I like the way that it's changed and developed recently. And
one of the highlights for me was, I mean, you have used the architecture. One of the highlights for me was last year or the year before now? So we've skipped a year, haven't we?
Yeah.
But I keep saying last year when I actually mean 2019. The Bridgette Riley exhibition, that amazing exhibition in the Hayward Gallery, when you and your ensemble played Steve Reich drumming in front of and surrounded by these huge Bridgette Riley canvases. And she, in fact, came, didn't she, to the first performance?
Yeah. That had been, that's a great example, actually, because that's something that we talked about for a long time. And of course, rightly, these things, all the best things do take a bit of time to settle down and to find the right place. And we waited for that moment where the Bridgette Riley exhibition was mounted, whereby drumming would make so much sense in that context. And that was in December 2019, when, unbeknownst to everybody, we were absolutely on that knife edge. And that's the last time I played with the group. It's the last time the group has been together. But it was superb. And the reason we wanted to do it in there was that the UK premiere of drumming way back in the day in the early 70s with Steve and a whole cohort of real mixture of musicians there, but was in the Hayward Gallery. And I thought, well, let's revisit that. Let's think of that again, and how does it sound now to play it there? And let's remember that event and think about the time that has passed, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's a good example of how the Southbank thinks and joins things together. It's not just a performance of drumming, but let's mount it with Bridgette Riley. Let's have it in the space that has historical significance. Yeah.
Well, we'll talk more about the relationship with Steve Reich's music in a moment, but I just wanted to sort of ask you about the fact or observe that I guess this thing, you have become known as a solo percussionist, as one of the world's great solo percussionists. But that is hard to remember, really. But that concept has really only existed, I'd say, in my working life, in my adult life. The percussion used to be the thing that was at the back of the orchestra, making the loud noises, and it came to the front of the orchestra, I guess. Do you want to give us a history lesson? What's your historical of how that happened?
Well, it was a release waiting to happen. I mean, it's for me, it's all music. My relationship with music and percussion's place in music and in the repertoire and in the concert hall is fundamentally tied to the composers of any given era. And of course, as you will know, music underwent the most extraordinary transformation, shake-up, and rethink, radical, unrecognizable rethink that what happened between the music, say, of kind of fin de siècle composers, like maybe starting with someone like Wagner, and then moving through early 20th century, Stravinsky, a personal favorite of mine, Bartók, and then on by modernists like Edgar Varèse, and then through onto post-Second World War radical modernists, Olivier Messiaen, and then onto his disciples, Pierre Boulez, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, and then onto Xenakis. These composers needed new sounds they wanted to tear everything up after the world itself had been torn up after the Second World War, particularly, and percussion was part of that. And we had our first sort of virtuoso pieces where a percussionist was asked to do the most extraordinarily dexterous contributions to a piece of music, probably from the early 60s. I mean, it's a work that I've played quite a bit at the Southbank, and one that I talk a lot with Gillian about, and she knows my performance of it, is Contacte by Stockhausen. And that's from 1960. And that, for all the music I've played and premiered, that remains one of the trickiest scores on the books, and it's from 1960. There were early concertos. Darius Milhaud, generally considered the writer of the very first percussion concerto. And that's actually from the late 20s, premiered in the early 30s, but the music from the late 20s. So impressive pedigree, but certainly a fledgling piece. Most students now, percussion students, would easily sight read it. I mean, it's sort of this kind of thing, you know, and fantastic. It had to start somewhere. And then the solo situation has happened very quickly, and particularly exponentially this century with many concertos, and very fine concertos that you know, fortunately myself and various others have found themselves playing with major symphony orchestras. I mean, you'll see percussion concertos all around the world with all the great orchestras, medium, large, small orchestras, and that has become the norm. But even 20 years ago, we were still just starting that particular game.
So I guess, I mean, you're not as a soloist, and we'll talk about your group in a minute, but you're not playing a repertoire that largely exists. You're having to create a new repertoire all the time. And that means, of course, working with composers, commissioning composers. How does that start? How do you have a conversation, you know, with a Helen Grime or a James McMillan or a Steve Reich or a you know, any of these Raul Tavara, any of these composers that have written for you? How does the conversation go? Is it a to and fro? Is it I like something like this, or do you just say, you know, give them the commission and get on with it? How does it work?
Yeah, lovely question. I mean, I always say the best thing about the music business is the people, and that's never more true than with the composers. And for all the composers I've worked with, I'll have a story for each of them, and they're all different, and you know, they all have their strengths and then their insecurities, and they're some are very bloody-minded, and others are completely open. And actually, sometimes it's easier to work with the bloody-minded ones because they will let you know exactly what they think, and everything's black and white. And other composers will honestly say to you things like, you know, teach me a rhythm. I don't know any cool rhythms. Teach me a groove, you know, and that can work too. And for me, like anyone, I'm certain it comes from an interest and, you know, very often a deep love of the composer's music. In Helen Grime's case, a very recent concerto, I'd known Helen's music for many years, and we'd become very close friends. Actually, when I lived in London, we were neighbors, and I got to know her music, and we talked about a concerto. And because of she's relatively busy and also very careful, maybe writing 2 pieces a year maximum, because it's very detailed music and the orchestration is rich and complex. And you know, we had to wait for the right time, and I found that very important, is to always wait for the slot with the composers. And when you get that right, that's when you get your masterpieces, as indeed Helen's concerto certainly is.
Mm-hmm. And you did that premiere with in our Soundscape Festival, I think it was in 2019.
Yeah.
There is this black hole, isn't there? That was just everything happened before. So I guess this brings me on to the kind of love affair with the music of Steve Reich. I mean, it's not hard to imagine why a wee boy who's been a percussionist, who is a percussionist, and is learning it, and falls in love with the music of Steve Reich, because percussion is the absolute basis of his music, isn't it? But can you tell us? I mean, you even founded your group, as I understand it, to play the music of Steve Reich, to play a specific piece. So can you tell us something about that? How did it start? How did the Reich love affair start? And tell us about the foundation of the Colin Currie Group.
Yes, well, indeed, if I may. And my first recollection of the music was actually seeing the physical copy of the one-page score for clapping music, which some of you will know, maybe even the majority will know. It's quite a well-known piece by Steve Reich for two hand clappers, which is an incredibly clever set of variations on one rhythm, and the rhythm is this. That's it. It just loops around. Off it goes. But the brilliance of it, I say it's a simple set of variations, but it's actually creates an amazingly compelling texture in this set of variations, in which one hand clapper stays stationary and their colleague keeps on shifting, moving their starting point in the same rhythm and creating a new composite rhythm. So they're kind of jamming off the same rhythm, but it's constantly turning like this amazing rhythmical mechanism. Very simple idea, but amazingly rich when you hear the work. If you've never heard the work, then do pop online or however you hear your music and check out clapping music. So when I was probably 12 or 13, I saw this piece and actually even tried to play it, and I'm sure played it all wrong and backwards and whatever else. But and then in my mid-teens and certainly coming down to London, this was the era of the compact disc, and we were, we'd save up and you'd buy a CD every month or this kind of thing. And one of my first albums was the music for 18 musicians, which was written in 1976. And that piece, we could easily spend the rest of this talk and the rest of the evening talking about that piece. When you hear it and when it strikes a chord, as it must and does with anyone who encounters this music, yeah, it's very, very hard to explain how you feel and what this music does for you. It's a very emotional piece. Even talking about it is very, very difficult at this point. But it goes very, very deep, and it's for this magnificent ensemble of 4 pianos, percussion, winds, strings, and female voices. And when I got to know this piece, I had no clue. I knew that I loved it, but I never dreamed I would get a chance to play it, or if I would, how on earth such a thing would be done. So yeah, I've been very fortunate to have had a lot of support in that regard.
I mean, you've hit on something there quite very fundamental, because like quite a lot of those experimental composers, I guess, thinking of people also like Gavin Bryars or Michael Nyman, Steve Martland that you work with, they wanted to write something away from mainstream orchestras and string quartets and ensembles that existed already, and create a unique sound and a unique way of playing. And therefore they just had to make their own bands, didn't they? It was like they were that generation of rock musicians. They were like rock musicians, I guess, because they were making their own bands and they made their music on that band. I mean, what I think is interesting about what you did with the Colin Currie Group, and I was actually witness to this happening at the Southbank, was that there was a moment when Steve Reich was able to relax enough this tradition of performance that he had started with this group. Philip Glass, of course, another one, that started in order to play this music that they believed the traditional ensembles wouldn't be able to do. They were then able to trust a new generation of composers. And there was this wonderful moment that happened backstage at the Queen Elizabeth Hall when I think it was the first time you met Steve Reich, when your group had just performed drumming on the Queen Elizabeth Hall stage. And I remember, well, it was a very moving occasion for me, because he actually said on the stage, I don't know, well, you must remember, I'm sure you remember it, because it's a very important moment, that, you know, this is the moment where I can hand on this tradition. I'm not romanticizing that. That's what actually happened.
Yeah, it is what happened. And you can imagine how nervous I was, maybe, where Steve was able, this concert had been scheduled for a time, and it was 10 years ago now, would you believe? And all of a sudden, Reich was able to visit London for that evening. I mean, he was around Europe doing other things, and he was able to attend in the evening. And whilst this made me delighted, this also made me extraordinarily nervous, because I knew, I mean, I knew that we played the piece very differently to how he played it with his ensemble. And the way that we played it indeed was also quite, strikingly different to how other recordings sound. But of course, we could only be ourselves. And with his schedule, he didn't attend any of the sound checks. And I suspected he'd be very exacting, and rightly so, and what good composers are. But we just had to play the piece. And when he came down to take his bow on the stage, he was kind of all welled up, and you could see there were tears in his eyes. And I thought, well, this is either awful or transcendental. And fortunately, it was the latter. And yeah, indeed, he's talked of my group. He feels like a bit of a grandfather to the group, because he can be with us and he can really enjoy his music. He trusts us. It's not just me. I mean, I have to say, I have and Gillian you'll back me up on this, I have the most outstanding team of players. It's an absolute team where everyone's got each other's back, and it works beautifully, and everyone can shine, but it's a real band. It's a good band that way. Yeah, I mean, of course, we've had our moments with Steve, and he is very exacting, and sometimes he has had to put his foot down and say, no, you got to do it this way, and I don't like that, and you know, we embrace that too. But it has become this fantastic relationship, and we've actually stayed quite close over the course of the last year, and lovely emails. He's always got time. He's a very generous man, personally as well.
I mean, it's interesting, those of you who've seen either, you know, a piece like Drumming or Music for 18 Musicians, or Six Marimbas, and you know, those sort of classic pieces, they're so, watching them is just like kind of balletic as well, because it's such an we described it, I remember in that talk, which was the first time you'd ever met Steve, you and Steve had ever met on the Queen Elizabeth Hall 10 years ago. I remember asking him in that talk if he thought of it as chamber music, because we put it in the chamber music series, and he said absolutely it's chamber music. And it is that, you know, you're sometimes passing on all the things we're not allowed to do at the moment, of course.
Yeah.
We're trying to work out how to do a COVID safe Music for 18 Musicians, aren't we? But you know, that you're sort of intersecting with your arms and passing on mallets and that sort of thing. It is a very intimate kind of music, isn't it?
Oh, for sure. I mean, watching a good performance of his music, yeah, particularly Music for 18 is a very good example. I always think of it very much as it looks, if you take a little step back from it, like an organism. Mm-hmm. And everything has to function for the music to work and for the organism to remain buoyant or stay alive. And also, that piece is particularly emotional, I think, because there's a lot of each of the phrases that you hear, a lot of the piece has this kind of a shape. This happens throughout the whole piece. These famous bass clarinets often. It's linked to the natural length of the human breath. So it's almost as if this organism is breathing, and you can hear it from the musicians. And the piece is wonderfully spun together, because the next section will only happen once a certain piece of information has been communicated by a certain musician to the rest of the ensemble. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes, again, like a living, breathing person or animal or creature or whatever you would say. It relies on this absolute bond and intimacy between the different parts of the organism or the people in the chamber ensemble.
I mean, yeah, that piece to me is, as you say, it's written in 1976. It is quite a landmark because so many of the works before that were those mechanical pieces, like, pendulum music or piano phase or violin phrase, or the tape loop pieces, setting up a process and letting it happen. Whereas this is much more, it's more human. You just said that human breath thing. It's got this real human intervention, and he's made this gorgeous upholstered sound with those instruments that you were just talking about, the bass clarinets, the human voices, the pianos and the marimbas, etc. It's just amazing. But we're going to talk, since that time, Steve was obviously inspired by you and your group and has written a number of pieces. But I think we should talk now. This is a sort of sneak preview. We've not announced this yet, but early in next season, which we hope to announce in not too distant future, on the 19th of October, in fact, so mark it in your diary discreetly, is the UK premiere of a new work called Traveller's Prayer, which which Steve has written for your group, and you will be not playing in, Colin, that's right, but conducting, which I think was also the case with the previous piece, Reich Richter, that he wrote for you. And that's another example of trust between musicians. This is Steve's pandemic piece. He's been writing it in, I think, mainly Los Angeles over the last year. Could you tell us something about it, about the Traveller's Prayer? What's that about? And tell us about also the sound of the piece, the sound it's going to make.
Yes. Well,
you've got the score, I take it, have you?
I have the score now, yes. I've had it not that long, actually, just a couple of weeks maybe. And it appears very much that he is going even deeper into this rather open space in his music, which we found is probably starting with a piece like Pulse, which is from 2015. And then on through certainly Reich Richter, where the augmentation of the note values, so the notes get longer and longer and longer and longer. They start very dense, and then eventually they break down and become separated by quite a lot of space, which is unusual in Steve's music. There's usually a motoric element. There's usually something somewhere going keeping the whole piece together. But there's no. Well, his phrase was interesting. His phrase was in Traveller's Prayer, there is no pulse.
Wow.
And that in a way that's true. Of course, the piece is held together by note values and a meter system, barring, and it's 2/4, 5/8. So there's a pulse in that sense, but certainly no discernible pulse very, very often. And it's very, very much a tender work. I think it's a serious work, and it was conceived before the pandemic. And the setting of the Psalms is 3 Psalms are set, and it's very much to do. The concern of the words is to do with the safe delivery of this person, of this traveler, and that they would have a safe journey. Sounds glib putting it that way, but that they will travel well and that they will arrive and that all shall be well. So it's spiritually craving a safe arrival, and of course for me, it goes beyond the literal sense. I mean, we're not talking about catching a train from Waterloo to Lewisham. It's a spiritual arrival and maybe some kind of passing towards the end of one's life. So a very emotional work for our time, and extremely thought-provoking and deep.
It's interesting because you know, I think of Steve as one of the great religious composers, actually, which is not often the way it's expressed, but clearly he has increasingly, as his life's gone on, a strong religious faith, a Jewish faith, and has has written some great religious works such as Tehillim, again a setting of the Psalms, this work, and a number of others which set biblical texts. But also, I'm really interested in the spiritual in his music, in music that doesn't set text as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
I remember asking him about how, in one of the talks we did, I think it was the Festival Hall, about how come I was moved by, a piece like Pendulum Music, for example, which is basically just, it's the swinging of microphones, and you basically just do let the microphones swing and they make these rhythms, and the human being steps back. And I said, well, how come I feel moved by that? And he said, kind of semi sotto voce, he said, it's God. He really believes that that spiritual element in his music. And I just wondered about, when you're playing it, are you aware of that? Not necessarily sharing any belief system, but are you aware of that kind of spiritual nature, and do you feel a responsibility to it?
Very much so, very, very much so. And I agree with everything you've said. He, in a unique way, and I mean that's a very overused word, of course, but in a unique way, he is a composer who will give the listener that space to find this spiritual width, grandeur, perhaps, connection, intimacy. It's going to be different for every subjective experience, but he is the one. And that really does sound religious. He is the one who, without you knowing it or understanding what's going on, certainly I don't understand it either, but I've certainly experienced it. And it's those moments, and it could be anything. Actually, drumming, I find drumming does this to me time after time. I can't play even part one of that piece without having some kind of near enough out-of-body experience, where the notes and the sounds hypnotize me and put me in this condition of hyper mindfulness that I think really is unique to his music, genuinely.
I guess there's something also in that about the extreme concentration required to play those often repetitive, selling those classic pieces, those repetitive patterns, and get them just right, and get in the right place and make the right sound with those instruments. I guess there's something about that extreme, particular kind of concentration, which surely you need to, or surely it generates something like that, what you just talked about, sort of extreme mindfulness. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, it's been used down the centuries, the participation in a ritual, and I think there's a ritualistic element to his music, where you're very close, often, with your other musicians, and as I've said already this evening, you rely on each other, and your own ability to move on in any piece of music is reliant on someone else. So you're always got your ears out for somebody else, wherever you are in the group. There are no real soloists in these pieces. And yeah, I think it brings you into, I mean, if you have a bond, any time you play drumming with another musician, or music for 18 musicians, many of the works, you have this sort of bond for life. I mean, I'm not joking. It brings you close in a way that cannot be put into words.
I guess, Colin, we can tentatively reveal that there will be a performance of your group playing, Colin Currie Group playing Steve Reich before the autumn, which is in the summer. The exact details are yet to be finalised, but we're hoping to have multiple performances in one day of music for 18 musicians. I mean, you've always wanted to do that, haven't you? You've always, it's like, you know, sort of almost do it like an art installation, so that it's, you know, it does lend itself to that, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think it became, you know, if we can't do that now, when can we do it? And I'm very grateful of our discussions, because we have this great history, Steve Reich, myself, and you, Gillian, and your support, and we plan these events together, and it's always such a pleasure. And the first time I ever played music for 18 musicians was also at the Southbank Centre in The Rest Is Noise.
That's right.
In 2013. Yeah, so and then it felt like, and I believe you would agree with me, that my group, because of the way we play the piece, that piece with my ensemble at the Royal Festival Hall has really become a sort of hot London ticket thing. Yeah. And I'm really proud of that. And I think the piece suits the space. It sounds good in there. And we're all just so fond of performing that music in that room. So, and I was actually on the phone to Michaela Haslam from Synergy Vocals the other day, who will be providing the singers. And we both said, yeah, I can't think of anything better right now than doing music for 18 at the Southbank. So
what about what about the stamina of playing that repetitive stuff and the singers doing that very high stuff, you know, several times, not just once? Are you worried about that?
Well, I mean, I did say to my agent, you know, we should recheck with each musician that everyone's okay with this. Yeah. And I think at the moment, everyone just says yes to everything. I guess after a whole year of inactivity, you know, if we had to play it 10 times, I'm sure we'd all agree. But I think three performances, they'll be spaced out, of course, and we'll have a break. And certainly from a percussionist's point of view, it's good to get in the groove, get nice and warmed up. I think that'll be just fine. I mean, something to really enjoy. So
I just wanted to thank all of you for coming, and again, thank you for your continued support of Southbank Centre. It means so much to us that you've stuck with us for the year, and we're really grateful to that, because you know we all need our friends, and we'll need you just as much, and even more when we reopen again, and look forward to seeing you then. I just want to say a special thank you to Colin. I think you'll also, it's been fascinating to hear, I mean, I've talked to you many times, Colin, but I always hear new things, and it was great to hear, particularly about your special relationship with Steve, and I'm sure all of us will, I'm sure all of you will join me in wishing him the very best for a speedy recovery. He's already on the ball. He's been, you know, letting us know what he wants to be said about the piece and about his situation. So he's definitely on the ball, and it's just great to hear that. So thank you very much, Colin, and thank you, everybody. And we'll see you again. We'll keep an eye out for the next Green Room events. It's going to be continuing with lots of great artists, not just musicians, but writers and painters and visual artists and performers. So please join us. Thank you very much.